The distant wail of a locomotive whistle cut through the evening air as flames licked hungrily at the walls of the Carson homestead, transforming what had once been a dream into a waking nightmare for Ethan Wilcox, who charged back into the inferno despite the desperate pleas of the onlookers who had gathered in horror to witness the spectacle of destruction. That fateful night in the summer of 1878 had forever changed him, leaving scars that ran deeper than the twisted, mottled flesh that now covered the right side of his face and neck, a permanent reminder of both his courage and his failure. The townspeople of Glenrio, New Mexico, would later whisper that he'd been brave but foolish, trying to save what couldn't be saved, and in the process, losing parts of himself that could never be restored. Ethan had been passing through town that evening, his horse tired from the long journey across the territory. He'd planned to spend just one night at the modest boarding house before continuing west toward Arizona. But the sudden commotion, the screams, and the ominous orange glow on the horizon had changed everything. By the time he'd arrived at the Carson place on the outskirts of town, the flames had already consumed most of the barn and were spreading rapidly to the main house. Without hesitation, he dismounted and rushed toward the chaos. A terrified young boy had emerged from the smoke, coughing and crying for his father, who remained trapped inside. Ethan hadn't thought twice before plunging into the burning structure. He'd found James Carson pinned beneath a fallen beam, unconscious but alive. With strength born of desperation, Ethan had managed to lift the heavy timber just enough for the older man to be dragged free. They had almost reached the door when a portion of the ceiling collapsed. Ethan had instinctively shielded Carson with his own body as burning debris rained down upon them. The searing pain had been unlike anything he'd ever experienced, worse than the bullet he'd taken during his brief stint as a deputy in Colorado. Worse even than the time he'd been thrown from a wild Mustang and broken 3 ribs. This pain had melted into his very being, becoming one with him as the flames hungrily devoured his flesh. Somehow, he'd managed to stumble out of the building with Carson before collapsing on the hard, packed dirt. The last thing he remembered before losing consciousness was the sound of women crying and men shouting as they worked to contain the fire that had already taken too much. That had been 2 years ago. James Carson had recovered from his injuries, but Ethan's life had been irreversibly altered. During the long, painful weeks of recovery at Doc Miller's clinic, he'd had ample time to contemplate the cruel twist of fate that had transformed him from a man women once smiled at into a monster they now shied away from on the street. Upon his release, he'd retreated to a small cabin in the foothills outside of Glenrio, a property Carson had insisted on giving him in gratitude for saving his life. There, Ethan had lived in relative solitude, venturing into town only when absolutely necessary for supplies. He'd learned to time his visits for the quietest hours, to keep his head down, and to ignore the poorly concealed expressions of revulsion that followed him like persistent shadows. He'd taken to wearing a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his face, and a bandana across his nose and mouth, not as the disguise of an outlaw, but as a shield against the world's prying eyes. The right side of his face had healed as well as could be expected, but the patchwork of angry red skin, pulled taut in some places and puckered in others, remained a shocking sight even to him whenever he caught a glimpse of his reflection. Today, as Ethan rode slowly into town for his monthly supplies, the summer sun beat down mercilessly upon the dusty main street of Glenrio. A new stagecoach had just arrived, its weary passengers disembarking on wooden legs after days of uncomfortable travel. Among them was a woman he'd never seen before, tall and slender, with honey-colored hair neatly pinned beneath a modest hat. She stood out from the travel-worn crowd, her posture straight and dignified despite the obvious fatigue that showed in the slight droop of her shoulders. Something about her caught and held his attention, though he quickly admonished himself for staring. A woman like that would have no interest in a scarred recluse, and he had no right to gaze upon her as if she were some exotic creature on display. He tugged his hat lower and turned his horse toward the general store, determined to complete his errands and returned to the solitude of his cabin before too many townsfolk took notice of his presence. Inside Hartman's general store, Ethan handed his list to old Mr. Hartman, who had always treated him with a gruff sort of kindness that made these necessary excursions slightly more bearable. "The usual then, Mr. Wilcox?" Hartman asked, squinting at the carefully penned items. "Yes, sir." "And if you've got any of those coffee beans from back east, I'd appreciate a pound of those as well." As Hartman moved about the store gathering the requested items, the bell above the door chimed softly. Ethan kept his back to the entrance, hunching his shoulders slightly in an instinctive attempt to make himself less noticeable. "Good afternoon," came a melodious female voice that he instantly recognized as belonging to the woman from the stagecoach. "I'm looking for Mr. James Carson. I was told his mercantile establishment would be in town, but it seems I've been misdirected. Carson's place burned down couple years back," Hartman explained. "He's got a smaller shop now down at the end of the street. Can't miss it, has a blue door." "Thank you kindly," she replied. "And might I trouble you for directions to a reputable boarding house? I've been traveling for quite some time and would dearly love to rest somewhere comfortable. Mrs. Willoughby runs a fine establishment just across from the church," Hartman said. "Tell her I sent you and she'll treat you right." "You've been most helpful, sir." Ethan listened to the exchange without turning, finding the woman's voice pleasant with its slight Eastern accent. He was so distracted by the cadence of her speech that he failed to notice she had moved to stand beside him until her voice came from much closer proximity. "Excuse me," she said softly, "but might you be familiar with this area? I'm new to Glenrio and finding myself rather overwhelmed." Startled, Ethan turned slightly, careful to keep the right side of his face angled away from her. "I don't come to town much, madam," he muttered, his voice rough from disuse. "I see," she replied, and he could feel her studying him with interest rather than the usual revulsion. "Well, thank you anyway. I'm Lillian Archer, recently arrived from Boston." Her forthrightness caught him off guard, as did her extended hand. Social niceties had become foreign to him over the past 2 years, and he hesitated before briefly taking her gloved hand in his. "Ethan Wilcox," he responded, the words feeling strange on his tongue. It had been months since he'd introduced himself to anyone. "A pleasure to meet you, Mr. Wilcox," she said, and he was struck by the sincerity in her tone. "Perhaps we'll cross paths again." Before he could formulate a response, she had collected a few small items from the counter and departed, leaving behind the faint scent of lavender and the unsettling feeling that something fundamental had shifted in Ethan's carefully constructed world of isolation. Later that evening, as Ethan led his laden horse back toward his cabin, he found himself thinking about Lillian Archer. There had been something in her direct gaze that had disarmed him, a straightforwardness that was neither pitying nor fearful. It had been so long since anyone had looked at him, as if he were simply a man rather than a curiosity or a cautionary tale. The next morning, Ethan woke to the sound of approaching hoofbeats, an unusual occurrence at his remote dwelling. He reached for the rifle he kept beside his bed, then paused when he heard James Carson's familiar voice calling his name. "Ethan, you decent in there? Got someone I'd like you to meet." Frowning, Ethan quickly donned his hat and bandana before stepping onto the porch. Carson sat astride his dun gelding, and beside him on a chestnut mare was none other than Lillian Archer, looking surprisingly at ease in a split riding skirt. "Morning," Ethan said cautiously, nodding to Carson while avoiding direct eye contact with the woman. "Hope we're not disturbing you too early," Carson said cheerfully. "Miss Archer here is my late wife's cousin from back east. She's come to help me with the new store and with Billy." Billy was Carson's 10-year-old son, a quiet boy who had never quite recovered from losing his mother to consumption the year before the fire. When James mentioned the man who saved his life lived nearby, I insisted on accompanying him to express my gratitude, Lillian explained, dismounting with surprising grace for an Eastern woman. "What you did was extraordinarily brave, Mr. Wilcox." Ethan shifted uncomfortably under her direct gaze. "Anyone would have done the same," he muttered. "I think we both know that's not true," she responded gently. Most would have deemed it too dangerous, and James would not be here today. There was an awkward silence before Carson cleared his throat. I was hoping you might consider doing some carpentry work for the store, Ethan. I've seen those shelves you built for your cabin, mighty fine craftsmanship. I'd pay fair wages, of course. Ethan hesitated. The thought of working in town, being subjected to stares and whispers day after day, made his stomach churn. But his funds were running low, and the occasional odd jobs he picked up from ranchers in the area barely covered his modest needs. I could bring the wood out here, Carson continued, sensing his reluctance. You could work at your own pace, bring the finished pieces in when you're ready. I'll think on it, Ethan finally replied, which was more than he would have offered yesterday. After they departed, he found himself strangely restless. The unexpected visit had disturbed the careful rhythm of his days, introducing an element of human connection he'd convinced himself he no longer needed or wanted. Over the next few days, Ethan caught himself thinking about Lillian Archer at odd moments, wondering what had brought her all the way from Boston to this dusty corner of New Mexico territory, and why she hadn't recoiled from him, as most people did. When Carson returned with a wagon full of lumber and detailed sketches for the shelving units he needed, Ethan surprised himself by agreeing to the job. The work provided a welcome distraction from his increasingly confused thoughts. He lost himself in the precise measurements and clean cuts, in the satisfaction of transforming raw wood into functional pieces. By the end of the week, he had completed the first set of shelves, and Carson was due to collect them the following day. What he didn't expect was for Lillian to accompany Carson again, this time bringing a basket covered with a checkered cloth. "I hope you don't mind," she said after preliminary greetings had been exchanged. "I thought you might appreciate a home-cooked meal after all your hard work." The simple kindness struck Ethan like a physical blow. When was the last time someone had prepared food especially for him? The women of the town had brought meals during his convalescence, but that had been charity for a wounded man, not this straightforward offering that seemed to carry no obligation or pity. "That's thoughtful of you," he managed, leading them to the small table on his porch where they could eat in the open air. Lillian unpacked the basket with efficient movements, revealing fried chicken, biscuits, preserved peaches, and a small jar of honey. As they ate, Carson dominated the conversation, talking about the store and how business was improving now that the railroad had established a regular stop in Glen Rio. "Miss Archer here has some newfangled ideas about organization that have the ladies in town coming back twice as often," Carson said proudly. Lillian smiled. "Hardly newfangled, simply logical arrangements that make shopping more efficient." Ethan found himself watching her as she spoke, noting the animation in her features and the intelligence in her eyes. She caught him staring, and instead of looking away in embarrassment, smiled directly at him. Something unfamiliar fluttered in his chest. After they finished eating, Carson examined the completed shelves with obvious approval. "Fine work, Ethan, just fine. We'll get these loaded up, and I'll bring more lumber next week if that suits you." As they prepared to leave, Lillian lingered behind while Carson hitched the shelves to his wagon. "Mr. Wilcox," she began, her voice softer than before, "I hope you'll forgive my forwardness, but I've been hoping to ask a favor." Ethan tensed, immediately wary. "What sort of favor?" "James mentioned you know this area well, the safe trails, the places to avoid. I've always been fond of exploring, but James is understandably protective and reluctant to let me venture far alone." She hesitated, then continued with determination. "I was hoping you might be willing to serve as a guide occasionally. I would compensate you for your time, of course." Of all the requests she might have made, this was perhaps the most unexpected. Ethan stared at her, trying to understand her motives. "There are younger men in town who'd be eager for the job," he said finally. "Men whose company would raise fewer eyebrows." A flash of irritation crossed her features. "I'm 30 years old, Mr. Wilcox, well past the age where I concern myself with raised eyebrows. And I'm not asking for companionship, I'm asking for expertise." She paused, then added more gently, "But if you'd prefer not to, I understand." He should refuse. Every instinct for self-preservation urged him to decline, to retreat back into the solitude that had become both his prison and his sanctuary. But something, perhaps the genuine interest in her eyes, or simply the loneliness he'd been denying for too long, compelled him to nod once, curtly. "Saturday," he said. "If the weather holds, I'll come by Carson's place at dawn." Her smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "Thank you, Mr. Wilcox, I shall be ready." As he watched them drive away, Ethan was gripped by the unsettling certainty that he had just set something in motion that he might not be able to control or stop. True to his word, Ethan arrived at Carson's modest house on the edge of town as the first pale light of dawn was spreading across the eastern sky. He had spent a restless night alternating between anticipation and dread, questioning his decision to agree to this outing. By morning, he had nearly convinced himself that Lillian would have reconsidered, that he would find her politely apologetic but no longer interested in the expedition. Instead, she emerged from the house at the sound of his approach, dressed in practical riding attire and looking far more awake than anyone had a right to at such an early hour. Her hair was braided and pinned up beneath a wide-brimmed hat, and she carried a small satchel that presumably contained provisions for the day. "Good morning, Mr. Wilcox," she called, her voice carrying clearly in the still air. "I've been ready for an hour, I'm afraid." Excitement makes me an early riser. Ethan dismounted to help her with her horse, a gentle mare that Carson had evidently purchased for her use. "You've ridden before?" he asked, watching her check the cinch with practiced hands. "Since childhood," she confirmed. "Though mostly in parks and on gentle country lanes, not across open territory. That's why I value your guidance." Once they were both mounted, Ethan led the way out of town, conscious of curtains twitching in a few windows as early risers noted their departure. Let them talk, he thought with uncharacteristic defiance. It would give them something new to gossip about besides his scars. As they rode, the landscape gradually transformed from the scrubby outskirts of town to more rugged terrain, with sandstone formations rising dramatically against the brightening sky. Ethan pointed out landmarks and shared what he knew of their history, surprised by how easily conversation came after so many months of speaking to hardly anyone. Lillian proved to be an attentive listener and an eager learner, asking intelligent questions about the plants and wildlife they encountered. Her genuine interest in the land was refreshing. So many newcomers to the territory saw only harshness where Ethan had learned to recognize subtle beauty. By mid-morning, they had reached a small canyon with a spring-fed pool nestled among the rocks. Cottonwood trees provided welcome shade, their leaves rustling softly in the breeze. "This is lovely," Lillian breathed, dismounting and removing her hat to fan her flushed face. "How did you discover this place?" "Tracked an injured wolf here once," Ethan replied, securing the horses where they could drink from the pool. "Thought I might have to put it out of its misery, but it recovered on its own after a few days. I checked on it when I could." He hesitated, then added, "It let me get closer than most would." "Animals don't judge by appearances," Lillian observed quietly. Ethan stiffened, the easy mood of the morning suddenly shattered by her reference, however oblique, to his disfigurement. He turned away, busying himself with unpacking some food from his saddlebag. "I've offended you," she said after a moment. "I apologize." "No need," he replied tersely. "It's a fact, not an insult. Still, it was thoughtless of me to mention it so carelessly." She moved to stand beside him, not crowding but close enough that he could smell the lavender scent that seemed to cling to her. "I haven't thanked you properly for agreeing to this excursion. It means a great deal to me to see the true character of this land, not just the tamed version visible from town." Her sincerity was disarming, as was her refusal to pretend she hadn't noticed his scars. Most people either stared openly or studiously avoided looking at him at all, both responses serving to emphasize his otherness. Lillian's straightforward acknowledgement was strangely liberating. They sat in the shade to eat the simple meal they'd brought: bread, cheese, dried fruit, and jerky while watching a hawk circle lazily overhead. The silence between them had returned to companionable rather than strained. "May I ask what brought you to New Mexico territory?" Ethan ventured eventually. It's a long way from Boston. Lillian considered the question, taking a sip from her canteen before answering. Several factors converged. James's letter about his difficulties after the fire and Sarah's death reached me at a time when I was reassessing my life in Boston. She smiled wryly. I had recently declined a marriage proposal from a man my parents considered highly suitable. It created quite the scandal in our social circle. Ethan raised his eyebrows, intrigued despite himself. Why did you decline? He wanted a decorative wife who would manage his household and bear his children without troubling him with opinions or intellectual pursuits. She shrugged. I want more from life than to be someone's ornament, even a well-cared-for one. And your parents were disappointed but ultimately supportive. My father said he'd rather I be happily unmarried than miserably wed. Her expression softened with fondness. They understood when I explained my desire to help James and Billy. Sarah was my favorite cousin, and I had promised her I would look after them if anything ever happened to her. Ethan nodded, impressed by her determination and the clarity of her convictions. Most women of his acquaintance would have accepted the security of marriage regardless of personal compatibility. And what about you, Mr. Wilcox? What's your story? James mentioned you were passing through Glenrio when the fire occurred. Where were you headed? It was Ethan's turn to consider carefully before answering. Nowhere in particular, he admitted. I'd been drifting for a few years, taking work where I could find it. Was a deputy for a while in a mining town in Colorado, did some horse breaking for ranchers, even tried my hand at prospecting. He smiled faintly beneath his bandana. Wasn't much good at finding gold, but I learned a lot about the land. And now, she asked, do you plan to stay in Glenrio permanently? The question caught him off guard. He hadn't thought in terms of permanence for a long time, had simply existed from one day to the next without much consideration for the future. I suppose I do, he said slowly, realizing the truth of it as he spoke. Got no reason to move on, and Carson sold me that piece of land for next to nothing. First place I've owned outright. Lillian nodded, as if his answer satisfied something she'd been wondering about. It's important to have a place that feels like home, she said. I'm still finding my footing in Glenrio, but I think I could belong here in time. The conversation drifted to other topics as they finished their meal and rested before the return journey. Ethan found himself relaxing in a way he hadn't in years. The constant tension of anticipating rejection or revulsion gradually easing in the face of Lillian's straightforward manner. On the ride back to town, they encountered a small herd of pronghorn antelope, pausing to watch the graceful animals bound across the landscape with effortless speed. Lillian's delight in the sight was contagious, and Ethan found himself smiling behind his bandana, seeing the familiar territory through her appreciative eyes. As they approached Carson's house in the late afternoon, Ethan was surprised by a pang of regret that the day was ending. Lillian must have felt something similar, for she turned to him with unusual hesitation as they dismounted. I've had a wonderful day, Mr. Wilcox, I hope. That is, I would be very grateful if you might be willing to serve as my guide again sometime. I'd be happy to, he replied, the words coming easier than he would have expected. Just let me know when. Her smile was warm with genuine pleasure. Thank you, and please call me Lillian. Miss Archer makes me feel like a schoolteacher. He nodded, not quite able to reciprocate the invitation to use his given name, but appreciating the gesture nonetheless. As he rode back to his cabin, Ethan found himself looking forward to their next outing with an eagerness that should have alarmed him, but instead felt like the first tentative unfurling of something he had thought permanently withered within him. Over the next few weeks, Ethan and Lillian established a routine of Saturday excursions, exploring different areas around Glenrio. Each trip reinforced the unlikely connection forming between them, she with her Eastern refinement and forthright manner, he with his scarred exterior and cautious heart. Between these outings, Ethan continued crafting furniture for Carson's store, finding satisfaction in the steady work and the knowledge that his creations were being used and appreciated. Occasionally, he would deliver finished pieces himself rather than waiting for Carson to collect them, venturing into town during quiet hours. Each time, he found himself lingering a little longer, speaking with a few more people, the weight of self-consciousness gradually lessening. It was during one such delivery that he overheard a conversation that stopped him cold. He had just unloaded the last of a set of display cases when Mabel Turner, the seamstress whose shop adjoined Carson's, approached Lillian with a conspiratorial air. "I've been meaning to speak with you, Miss Archer," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the open doorway where Ethan stood. "About your situation." Lillian looked up from the inventory list she was checking, her expression politely inquiring. "My situation." "These outings with Mr. Wilcox," Mabel clarified, lowering her voice but not enough to prevent Ethan from hearing. "People are talking, you understand. A single woman spending so much time alone with a man, regardless of his condition, it raises eyebrows." Ethan felt a familiar coldness settle in his chest. Of course people would be talking. He should have anticipated this, should have known better than to think he could step back into normal society without consequences. "I appreciate your concern, Mrs. Turner," Lillian replied, her tone cooling perceptibly, "but Mr. Wilcox is a gentleman who has been kind enough to acquaint me with the local landscape. There is nothing improper about our arrangement." "Oh, I'm sure you believe that, dear," Mabel continued, undeterred. "But consider your reputation, and James's position in the community. It's not just about propriety, it's about judgment. Why, my Ernest says the man's mind might be as twisted as his face, living out there alone all these years. No one really knows anything about him from before the fire." Ethan had heard enough. He slipped out the back door, mounted his horse, and rode hard for the solitude of his cabin, self-recrimination burning as fiercely as the flames that had scarred him. He had been a fool to think he could have any kind of normal relationship, even a friendship. His presence in Lillian's life was causing her harm, subjecting her to gossip and judgment she didn't deserve. For the next 2 days, he threw himself into physical labor chopping wood until his arms ached, repairing his roof though it barely needed it, anything to exhaust himself enough that sleep might come without dreams. He resolved to send a note to Carson, declining any further carpentry work, and to make himself scarce whenever Lillian might be around. On Saturday morning, he deliberately overslept their usual meeting time, then busied himself with chores he had been postponing. When he heard the approach of a horse around midday, he considered hiding in the cabin but instead steeled himself for the necessary conversation. Lillian dismounted before he could speak, her expression a mixture of concern and irritation. "You weren't at James's this morning," she stated, foregoing a greeting. "I was worried something had happened to you." "I'm fine," he replied shortly. "Just busy, should have sent word." She studied him with those penetrating eyes that seemed to see more than he wanted to reveal. "You overheard Mrs. Turner the other day, didn't you?" When he didn't respond, she sighed. "I thought as much. You disappeared rather suddenly." "She had a point," Ethan said gruffly, keeping his distance. "People talk." "Your reputation, my reputation, is my concern, not yours," Lillian interrupted firmly. "And certainly not Mabel Turner's, whose own history would make fascinating gossip if I were the type to engage in such things." Despite himself, Ethan felt a flicker of curiosity. What history? A smile tugged at the corner of Lillian's mouth. That would be telling. Suffice it to say, she's the last person who should be casting judgment. Her expression sobered. But that's not the point. "The point is that I value our friendship, Mr. Wilcox, Ethan, and I won't let small-minded whispers deprive me of it." The use of his given name caught him off guard, as did the determination in her voice. "It's not just about the gossip," he admitted reluctantly. I've been pretending things could be normal. They can't be, not for me." He gestured vaguely toward his covered face. "This isn't going away, people won't ever see past it." "Some people won't," she agreed quietly, "but some people will, I do." The simple declaration hung in the air between them, laden with meaning Ethan wasn't sure he was ready to examine. Before he could formulate a response, Lillian continued, her tone deliberately lighter. "Now, are you going to invite me in for some coffee, or shall we stand out here in the sun all day? I brought apple cake from Mrs. Flores. She says you helped repair her wagon last month and refused payment." The abrupt change of subject caught him off balance, as did the reminder of a small kindness he'd nearly forgotten. Wordlessly, he gestured toward the cabin, following her inside with the sense that he'd lost control of a situation he hadn't fully understood to begin with. The interior of Ethan's cabin was simple but meticulously maintained, with furniture he had crafted himself, and a few carefully chosen items that reflected his appreciation for craftsmanship. A Navajo blanket hung on one wall, a set of hand-carved chess pieces displayed on a shelf, a rocking chair with intricate spindles positioned by the hearth. "This is lovely," Lillian remarked, taking in the space with genuine interest. "You've created a real home here." Her approval warmed him more than it should have, and he busied himself with preparing coffee to hide his pleasure. As the water heated on the stove, he found himself removing his hat and bandana for the first time in her presence, a silent acknowledgement of something shifting between them. He kept his scarred side turned away from her, an ingrained habit he couldn't yet overcome. They sat at his small table, sharing the apple cake and coffee as conversation gradually returned to familiar ease. Lillian spoke of her work at the store, of Billy's progress with his schooling, of her letters from her parents in Boston. Ethan found himself sharing more than usual about his own experiences, memories of his childhood in Pennsylvania, his journey west after his parents' deaths, the various jobs and places that had shaped him. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Lillian rose reluctantly. "I should return before dark. James will be wondering where I've disappeared to." Ethan walked her to her horse, still uncertain about their future interactions but no longer determined to sever the connection completely. As she prepared to mount, Lillian turned to face him fully. "I meant what I said earlier," she told him, her gaze direct and unwavering. "I see you, Ethan, not just the scars but the man beneath them. A good man, a skilled craftsman, a person of integrity and kindness. I wish you could see yourself as I do." Before he could respond, she had swung into the saddle and was guiding her horse toward town, leaving Ethan standing in the yard with her words echoing in his mind and an unfamiliar feeling expanding in his chest, something dangerously close to hope. The weeks that followed marked a subtle but significant shift in their relationship. Their Saturday excursions resumed, but with a new layer of understanding between them. Ethan gradually relaxed his vigilance about keeping his scarred side turned away from Lillian, though he still wore the bandana in public. In the privacy of his cabin or in remote areas where they stopped to rest, he would sometimes remove it, noting with a mixture of gratitude and bewilderment that she never flinched or looked away. Summer deepened into autumn, bringing cooler temperatures and spectacular sunsets that painted the mesas in shades of gold and crimson. On one such evening in late September, they lingered longer than usual at a high overlook, watching as the sinking sun transformed the landscape into something almost otherworldly. "I never imagined such beauty existed," Lillian murmured, her face bathed in the warm light. "In Boston, the sunsets are lovely, but nothing like this vastness, this sense that you're witnessing something ancient and eternal." Ethan nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. "It puts things in perspective," he said quietly, "makes human troubles seem smaller somehow." Lillian glanced at him, her expression thoughtful. Yet human connections remained significant, despite the vastness, perhaps even more so because of it. The air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken possibilities. Ethan found himself standing closer to her than he normally would have allowed, drawn by something stronger than his habitual caution. When Lillian's hand brushed against his, he didn't pull away. The moment was interrupted by the distant rumble of thunder. Looking toward the horizon, Ethan could see a bank of dark clouds approaching from the west, promising one of the violent storms that occasionally swept across the territory. "We should head back," he said reluctantly. "That storm's moving fast, and we don't want to be caught in the open." They mounted quickly and set off toward Glenrio, but the storm moved faster than anticipated. Within half an hour, the wind had picked up dramatically, bending the scrub brush and whipping dust into small cyclones that danced across their path. The first heavy drops of rain began to fall as lightning split the darkening sky. We won't make it to town before this hits full force, Ethan shouted over the rising wind. There's a lined shack about a mile east of here. We can wait it out there. Lillian nodded, rain already plastering tendrils of hair to her face as they urged their horses to a faster pace. By the time they reached the abandoned herder's shack, they were both soaked through and shivering as the temperature dropped precipitously with the storm's arrival. The interior of the shack was dusty but dry, with a small wood stove in one corner and a narrow cot against the wall. Ethan worked quickly to start a fire while Lillian wrung water from her sodden clothing as best she could. "Your dress will never dry like that," Ethan observed, trying to keep his tone matter-of-fact. "There should be some old blankets in that trunk. Not exactly clean, but better than pneumonia." Lillian hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Turn your back, please," she requested, though her voice held more practical concern than maidenly modesty. Ethan obliged, focusing on feeding the small fire until it burned steadily. Behind him, he could hear the rustle of wet fabric as Lillian struggled out of her heavy riding skirt and jacket. "This is quite the adventure," she remarked with forced lightness. "Not exactly what I had in mind for today's excursion." "Nature has its own plans," Ethan replied, relaxing slightly as the familiar rhythm of their conversation reasserted itself despite the unusual circumstances. "You can turn around now." She had wrapped herself in a faded wool blanket, her wet clothes spread near the stove to dry. Her hair hung loose around her shoulders, beginning to curl as it dried in the increasing warmth of the small space. Even disheveled and wrapped in a herder's blanket, she maintained a dignity that Ethan found remarkably endearing. "You should get out of those wet clothes too," she said practically. "There are more blankets." It was a sensible suggestion, but one that filled Ethan with immediate unease. Since the fire, he had been careful to keep his body covered in the presence of others. The scars extended down his neck onto his shoulder, and part of his chest, a fact known only to Doc Miller and himself. Seeing his hesitation, Lillian's expression softened. "I'll turn my back," she offered quietly. "But please don't risk your health over unnecessary concerns." Her delicate phrasing of what they both knew was his deep-seated self-consciousness somehow made it easier to accept her suggestion. Ethan nodded once, and Lillian turned to face the wall, giving him privacy to quickly strip off his soaked shirt and trousers, wrapping a blanket around his waist before removing his undergarments as well. "All decent," he announced gruffly when he had finished, now wearing one blanket around his waist and another draped over his shoulders, leaving his scarred chest partially visible. Lillian turned back to him, her gaze meeting his without dropping to examine his exposed skin. The acceptance in her eyes was more warming than the fire crackling in the stove. They sat side by side on the edge of the cot, close enough for warmth, but maintaining a careful space between them as the storm raged outside. Conversation flowed naturally despite their state of undress, ranging from childhood memories to books they had both read, to dreams they had harbored and sometimes abandoned. "I always wanted to see the ocean," Ethan admitted at one point. "The real ocean, not just lake shores or river banks. Something so vast you can't see the other side." "It's magnificent," Lillian told him. "Terrifying and beautiful all at once. The Atlantic in winter is especially powerful, gray waves tall as a house sometimes, crashing against the rocks with a sound like the world ending and beginning all at once." "You make it sound like poetry." "Nature is poetry," she replied, smiling. "You taught me that, showing me this land through your eyes." The storm continued well into the evening, rain drumming steadily on the tin roof of the shack. As darkness fell outside, the small space became a world unto itself, illuminated only by the orange glow of the fire. Their clothes were still damp, and by mutual unspoken agreement, they decided to wait out the night rather than risk the treacherous conditions in the dark. The single narrow cot presented an obvious challenge, which Ethan addressed by insisting Lillian take it while he made a pallet on the floor with spare blankets. "Don't be ridiculous," she objected. "You'll be uncomfortable and there's no reason for it. We're both adults." "We can share the cot without impropriety. Carson would have my hide," Ethan muttered, though he had to admit the hard-packed dirt floor held little appeal after a long day of riding. "James is not my keeper," Lillian replied firmly, "and he knows your character as well as I do. Now, stop being stubborn and get some rest. I promise your virtue is safe with me." The last was said with a teasing smile that somehow diffused the tension of the situation. In the end, they compromised, laying head to foot on the narrow cot with a folded blanket between them as a token nod to propriety. Despite the awkward arrangement, Ethan found himself drifting toward sleep, lulled by the rain and the even sound of Lillian's breathing. He was on the edge of consciousness when he felt her shift position, moving to sit up. He opened his eyes to find her studying him in the dimming firelight, her expression unreadable. "What is it?" he asked, his voice rough with approaching sleep. "I was just thinking," she replied softly, "about how strangely life unfolds. 6 months ago, I was in Boston, surrounded by society but feeling utterly alone. Now I'm in a herder's shack in the middle of nowhere during a thunderstorm, and yet—" She paused, seeming to search for the right words. "And yet I've never felt less alone." The simple honesty of her statement resonated deeply with Ethan, echoing his own unacknowledged feelings. Before he could formulate a response, Lillian had lain back down, and soon her breathing had deepened into sleep. Ethan remained awake a while longer, watching the play of fading firelight across the rough-hewn ceiling, and contemplating the strange twist of fate that had brought this remarkable woman into his life just when he had resigned himself to solitude. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a washed, clean world glistening in the early sunlight. Their clothes had dried enough to be wearable, if somewhat stiff and wrinkled. They set out for town as soon as they had put the shack back in order, both aware of the potential for gossip if their overnight absence was noted. As they approached the outskirts of Glenrio, Lillian broke the companionable silence that had accompanied much of their return journey. "I hope you won't retreat again after this," she said, glancing sideways at him. "Last time people talked, you disappeared for days. I'd rather not have to track you down again." Ethan considered her words, recognizing the concern beneath the light tone. "I can't promise not to need space sometimes," he replied honestly, "but I won't vanish without a word again." Her smile was worth the effort it had cost him to make that commitment. "Good. Because I've grown rather accustomed to our Saturdays, Mr. Wilcox, and would be most displeased to see them end." The formality of Mr. Wilcox was belied by the warmth in her voice, and Ethan found himself smiling beneath his bandana as they rode into town, heedless of the curious glances that followed their disheveled appearance. News of their overnight absence spread through Glenrio with predictable speed, but to Ethan's surprise, the reaction was less judgmental than he had feared. Carson, after an initial period of obvious concern, seemed to accept their explanation about the storm with minimal skepticism. If anything, the incident seemed to cement Ethan's gradual reintegration into the community, as if surviving a perilous situation with the respected Miss Archer had somehow proven his worth. October brought the Harvest Festival, an annual tradition in Glenrio that Ethan had observed from a distance since the fire. This year, however, Carson and Lillian both insisted he attend, with Carson going so far as to commission a special order of merchandise that absolutely had to be delivered on the day of the festival. Reluctantly, Ethan found himself in the town square on a crisp autumn afternoon, surrounded by festive decorations and the mingled aromas of roasting meats, baking pies, and sweet treats. Children ran between stalls laughing. Women gathered in groups to compare preserves and needlework entered in various contests, and men congregated near the makeshift stage where music would be played later in the evening. Ethan delivered Carson's order a set of display shelves for preserved goods, and was preparing to make a quick exit when he caught sight of Lillian approaching through the crowd. She wore a dress he hadn't seen before, a deep blue that complemented her eyes, with her hair arranged more elaborately than usual beneath a small hat adorned with a single feather. "You came," she said, sounding genuinely pleased. "I wasn't sure you would, even with James's transparent ruse." "Seemed rude to refuse a paying customer," Ethan replied, suddenly acutely aware of his worn clothing and the bandana that marked him as different from the other men present. Lillian seemed to read his discomfort. "Would you walk with me?" she asked, indicating the various stalls and displays. "I've never experienced a harvest festival in this part of the country. I'm curious about the local traditions." It was an offer he could accept without feeling like a burden or an object of pity, just two friends exploring the festivities together. As they moved through the square, Ethan was conscious of the glances they attracted, but was surprised to note that many were followed by friendly nods or greetings rather than the averted eyes he had become accustomed to. They sampled food from various stalls, admired handcrafts displayed for judging, and watched children participating in games of skill and chance. Throughout it all, Lillian maintained a steady stream of conversation that put Ethan at ease without seeming forced. As afternoon turned to evening, lanterns were lit around the square, creating pools of golden light that gave the scene a magical quality. Musicians took to the stage, and couples began gathering for dancing. "I should probably head back," Ethan said, the prospect of remaining during this more intimate phase of the celebration making him uneasy again. "Before the dancing," Lillian asked, disappointment evident in her voice. "I was hoping you might partner me for at least one set." Ethan stared at her, certain he had misheard. "You want to dance with me? Is that so surprising? You're the person I've chosen to spend most of my free time with for months now. Dancing is different," he muttered, glancing around at the couples already taking their places. "Everyone would stare. Let them," Lillian said simply. "I've never much cared for others' opinions when they conflict with my own judgment, and my judgment says you would be an excellent dancing partner." Her confidence was both baffling and infectious. Before he could formulate further objections, Ethan found himself being led toward the area cleared for dancing as the musicians struck up a lively tune. "I haven't danced in years," he warned as they took their positions. "Might step on your toes." "I'll risk it," she replied with a smile that made his heart skip a beat. To his surprise, the steps came back to him more easily than expected, muscle memory guiding him through the familiar patterns. Lillian moved with grace and enthusiasm, her hand warm in his, her eyes never leaving his face as they circled with the other dancers. When the music ended, there was a smattering of applause, and Ethan realized with a start that they had drawn some attention, not negative, but curious and even approving. Before he could process this, the musicians began another tune, slower this time, and Lillian looked at him questioningly. "One more," she asked, and he found he couldn't refuse her anything in that moment. This dance brought them closer together, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder, his at her waist. The proximity was intoxicating, filling his senses with the scent of lavender and the warmth of her body moving in harmony with his. "People will talk," he murmured, though with less concern than he might have expressed weeks earlier. "Let them talk of this then," Lillian replied softly. "Of how well we dance together, of how you haven't stepped on my toes once, of how I smile when I'm with you." The simple truth of her words struck Ethan like a physical force. She did smile in his presence genuinely, warmly, without the strain or pity he had grown to expect from others. And he realized with a sense of wonder, smiled back more often than not, the expression no longer feeling foreign on his damaged face. As the dance ended, they remained standing close together, something unspoken passing between them. It was Carson who broke the moment, approaching with young Billy in tow. "Ethan, didn't expect to see you still here," he said cheerfully. "Billy's been asking when you might teach him more about tracking. Boy's got it in his head he wants to be a scout when he grows up." Billy, now 12 and growing rapidly, looked up at Ethan with undisguised admiration. "Pa says you can read sign better than anyone, even the Navajo scouts that sometimes come through." Ethan felt a rush of unexpected pleasure at the boy's enthusiasm. "Your pa exaggerates," he said gruffly, "but I'd be happy to show you a few things sometime." The conversation shifted to plans for such an outing, then to Carson's business, the upcoming election for town marshal, and various other local matters. Throughout it all, Ethan was conscious of Lillian standing beside him, her presence a steady support as he navigated this most extended social interaction he had experienced since the fire. Later, as he walked Lillian and the Carsons back to their home, Ethan found himself reflecting on the evening with a sense of cautious optimism. For the first time in years, he had spent hours in public without overwhelming self-consciousness, had conversed with townspeople who treated him more as a neighbor than a curiosity, had even danced in full view of everyone. At Carson's gate, Billy ran ahead into the house, while Carson lingered just long enough to thank Ethan for the delivery before tactfully following his son, leaving Ethan and Lillian alone in the soft glow of the porch lantern. "Thank you for staying," Lillian said quietly. "It meant a great deal to me." "I should be thanking you," Ethan replied, struggling to articulate the complex gratitude he felt. "For encouraging me, I wouldn't have been there at all without your insistence." She smiled, reaching out to briefly touch his arm, a gesture that had become familiar between them. "You give me too much credit. The courage was yours all along, you just needed a reminder of what you're capable of." The simple faith in her words moved him deeply. Acting on impulse rather than careful consideration for once, Ethan reached up and slowly unwound the bandana from his face, exposing his scars fully to her gaze in the lamplight. Lillian's expression remained unchanged, no pity, no revulsion, just the same warm regard she had shown him all evening. Her hand lifted, hesitating just short of touching his damaged cheek. "May I?" she asked softly. Heart hammering in his chest, Ethan nodded once, bracing himself for the contact. Her fingers were gentle as they traced the ridged landscape of his scars, exploring without hesitation the feature that had defined and confined his existence for 2 long years. "You're beautiful to me," she whispered, her eyes holding his with unwavering sincerity. "Not despite these, but including them. They're part of you, part of your story, your courage, your heart." Something broke open inside Ethan at her words, a dam that had held back emotions he had refused to acknowledge for too long. Without conscious decision, he leaned forward, closing the distance between them until his lips met hers in a kiss that was both question and answer, tentative and certain all at once. Lillian responded without hesitation, her hand moving from his cheek to the back of his neck, drawing him closer as the kiss deepened into something neither of them had anticipated, but both had perhaps been moving toward since that first meeting in Hartman's general store. When they finally drew apart, Ethan rested his forehead against hers, eyes closed, absorbing the magnitude of what had just transpired. Lillian's hands remained on his shoulders, steady and sure. "I should go," he said reluctantly, aware of the lateness of the hour and the impropriety of their current position. "Yes," she agreed, though she made no move to step away. "But you'll come back tomorrow." The question held more weight than its simple wording suggested, and Ethan understood she was asking for reassurance that this moment wouldn't send him retreating back into isolation. "I'll come back," he promised, and sealed it with another brief kiss before finally stepping away. "Tomorrow." As he rode back to his cabin under a canopy of stars, Ethan felt a lightness he hadn't experienced in years, perhaps ever. The future stretched before him not as an empty expanse to be endured, but as a path filled with possibilities he had long since stopped allowing himself to imagine. The following weeks were transformative for both Ethan and Lillian, as their relationship evolved from friendship into something deeper and more profound. Their Saturday excursions continued, but now included moments of tenderness, hands clasped as they walked, stolen kisses in the shelter of cottonwood groves, conversations that delved into hopes and dreams they had previously kept guarded. In town, Ethan began appearing more frequently and with less concealment, gradually reducing his reliance on the bandana until he wore it only when the weather warranted protection from dust or cold. The reactions from townspeople varied. Some remained uncomfortable or openly curious, but many, particularly those who had known him before the fire or who had benefited from his quiet assistance over the years, greeted him with increasing normalcy. Carson, who had watched the relationship develop with a combination of surprise and cautious approval, finally broached the subject one evening when Ethan joined them for supper, a now regular occurrence. "So," he began after Billy had been sent to bed, "I reckon you two have something you might want to discuss with me, as Lillian's nearest kin in these parts." Ethan and Lillian exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. It was Lillian who spoke first, her tone respectful but firm. "James, while I appreciate your concern, I believe you know that at my age I don't require permission or approval for my personal decisions." Carson held up his hands placatingly. "Now, I didn't mean to imply otherwise. Just thought, as family, I might be entitled to know what your intentions are, both of you," he added, looking pointedly at Ethan. "My intentions are honorable," Ethan said quietly, meeting Carson's gaze directly. "I care deeply for Lillian, more than I thought possible after everything. If she'll have me, I'd like to build a life with her." It was the first time he had articulated his feelings so explicitly, even to Lillian, and he felt a momentary vulnerability that was quickly eased by the warmth of her hand finding his under the table. "I will have you," she confirmed, her voice steady despite the emotion evident in her eyes. "Though we haven't discussed specifics yet." Carson nodded, seeming satisfied. "Well then, I reckon that's clear enough. You have my blessing for whatever that's worth." He smiled, a genuine expression that creased his weathered face. "Sarah would have liked this, I think. She always did believe in second chances." The conversation shifted to more practical matters, where they might live, what Lillian's parents might think, how soon they should formalize their commitment. Ethan found himself participating in this planning for the future with an eagerness that would have been unimaginable months earlier. Later, as he prepared to leave, Lillian walked him to the door, stepping outside onto the porch with him to ensure a moment of privacy. "Did you mean it?" she asked softly. "About building a life together." Ethan took her hands in his, marveling at how natural it felt now to initiate contact. "Every word," he assured her, "though I'm still not entirely convinced I deserve you." "Love isn't about deserving," she replied with the straightforward wisdom that had first drawn him to her. "It's about recognizing something in another person that resonates with your own soul." The poetry of her words contrasted with the practicality that usually characterized her speech, and Ethan found himself smiling. "Is that what happened? Your soul recognized mine. From the very beginning, I think," she admitted, "though it took my mind some time to catch up." He kissed her then, a deep and tender kiss that held promises for the future they were beginning to envision together. When they parted, Ethan found the courage to ask the question that had been forming in his mind for weeks. "Would Christmas be too soon?" he asked. "To be married, I mean." Lillian's eyes widened briefly in surprise before crinkling with pleasure. "Christmas would be perfect," she replied. "Just enough time to write my parents so they might consider traveling for the ceremony, but not so long that I have to wait to call you husband." The word husband sent a thrill through Ethan that was equal parts terror, and joy the prospect of such normal happiness, still feeling slightly unreal after so long believing it beyond his reach. "I should warn you," he said, only half joking, "the cabin will need considerable expansion to be suitable for a lady from Boston." "Then we shall expand it," Lillian replied practically. "I'm not without resources, you know. My grandmother left me a modest inheritance that I've barely touched. And I'm quite capable with a hammer when necessary." The image of elegant Lillian wielding construction tools made Ethan laugh out loud, a sound that still surprised him when it emerged unbidden. "I don't doubt it for a minute," he assured her. "But perhaps we can hire some help for the larger tasks." "A sensible compromise," she agreed, smiling up at him with such affection that his heart seemed to expand in his chest. "Now go home before James feels obliged to come out here and preserve my reputation." With a final quick kiss, Ethan mounted his horse and set off toward his cabin, his mind already racing with plans for the modifications needed to transform his bachelor quarters into a home suitable for a wife. The word still felt strange in his thoughts wife, but increasingly right, increasingly possible. The news of their engagement spread quickly through Glenrio, met with reactions ranging from genuine congratulations to barely concealed surprise. Mabel Turner and her circle expressed thinly veiled concern about Lillian's choice, but their opinions held increasingly little weight as more prominent members of the community, including the banker's wife and the new schoolteacher, made points of publicly supporting the match. Carson arranged for a letter to be sent to Lillian's parents via the faster route of telegram to Santa Fe and then post to Boston, explaining the situation and extending an invitation to the Christmas wedding. The reply, when it came several weeks later, was cautiously supportive, expressing some surprise at the speed of developments, but trusting in their daughter's judgment and promising to attempt the journey if weather and health permitted. Throughout November, Ethan divided his time between carpentry work for his growing list of customers and expansions to his cabin. With the help of Carson and several other men from town, he added 2 new rooms, a proper bedroom, and a small study where Lillian could write letters and pursue her interest in botanical sketching. He also constructed a larger kitchen with a window overlooking the valley, remembering how she had once mentioned enjoying the view while preparing meals. Lillian, meanwhile, divided her time between continuing to help Carson with the store and gathering the items needed to establish their household. She ordered linens and kitchen implements from the Montgomery Ward catalog, selected furniture from Ethan's growing inventory of finished pieces, and spent hours with Mrs. Flores learning to prepare the regional dishes that Ethan had developed a taste for during his years in the territory. As December arrived with its crisp, clear days and star-filled nights, the expanded cabin was nearly ready, lacking only the final touches that Lillian insisted on handling herself. The wedding was set for Christmas Eve, to be held in the small church in Glenrio and followed by a celebration at Carson's home. A week before the ceremony, the stagecoach arrived carrying a surprise not only Lillian's parents, the distinguished Mr. and Mrs. Archer from Boston, but also a trunk full of wedding finery that her mother had insisted on bringing despite the challenges of transcontinental travel. Ethan had been apprehensive about meeting the Archers, unsure of how Boston society would view their daughter's choice of a scarred, relatively uneducated frontiersman. His fears were neither entirely confirmed nor completely allayed upon their first meeting. Mr. Archer, a tall, distinguished man with Lillian's direct gaze, had shaken his hand firmly and assessed him with the calculating eye of a businessman evaluating an investment. Mrs. Archer, a still beautiful woman in her 50s, had been polite but reserved, her smile not quite reaching her eyes as she took in his appearance. "They'll come around," Lillian assured him after the initial introductions. "They just need time to see what I see in you. And what if they don't?" Ethan asked, the old insecurity resurfacing despite his efforts to suppress it. "Then they will miss out on knowing a wonderful son-in-law," she replied with the unwavering conviction that had been his anchor through the tumultuous emotions of recent months. "But they will. My father, particularly, he values character above all else." Lillian's prediction proved accurate. Over the next few days, as Mr. Archer observed Ethan's interactions with townspeople, his craftsmanship, and most importantly, the evident depth of his feelings for Lillian, his initial reservation gradually gave way to a grudging respect. By the time he and Ethan shared a quiet drink at the saloon 3 nights before the wedding, the older man was offering advice about marriage and inquiring about Ethan's business plans with genuine interest. Mrs. Archer took longer to warm to the situation, focusing her energy on ensuring the wedding arrangements met her standards despite the limitations of a frontier town. It was only when she discovered Ethan carefully crafting a writing desk as a wedding gift for Lillian, designed specifically to incorporate features her daughter had once mentioned appreciating, that her attitude softened noticeably. "You truly know her, don't you, Mrs. Archer observed, running her fingers along the smooth wood of the nearly completed desk. "Not just the obvious things, but the small details that make her who she is." "I try to," Ethan replied honestly. "She deserves to be known that way, Mrs. Archer studied him for a long moment before nodding once decisively. "Yes, I believe she does, and I think perhaps you're the one to do it." She smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her face. Welcome to the family, Mr. Wilcox. I believe we'll get along just fine. The day of the wedding dawned clear and cold, the sun rising over the eastern mesas to cast a golden glow across the frost-covered landscape. In Carson's house, Lillian prepared with the help of her mother and several local women who had become friends during her time in Glenrio. The dress, brought all the way from Boston, was simpler than what might have been expected for a society wedding, but perfectly suited to Lillian's taste: ivory satin with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs, elegant without ostentation. Ethan, meanwhile, donned a new suit purchased from Santa Fe, the nicest clothing he had owned since before the fire. As Carson helped him with his tie, the older man reminisced about his own wedding day to Sarah, his eyes misting with the memory. "She'd be pleased about this, you know," Carson said gruffly. "Always said you were a good man, even before the fire proved it beyond doubt." Ethan nodded, touched by the sentiment and the implicit acceptance it represented. "I wish she could be here," he replied. "She'd be proud of the job you've done with Billy, and how you've kept going." The two men shared a moment of silent understanding before Billy burst into the room, excited about his role as ring bearer and eager to show off his new boots, purchased specially for the occasion. By mid-morning, the small church was filled to capacity, with even those townspeople who had been most skeptical about the match present to witness the event. Ethan stood at the altar beside the minister, Carson at his side as best man, trying to control the nervous energy that had him shifting from foot to foot, until a reassuring hand on his shoulder steadied him. When the door opened and Lillian appeared on her father's arm, a collective murmur of appreciation rippled through the congregation. She was radiant, her face glowing with happiness beneath a simple veil that did nothing to hide the love in her eyes as they met Ethan's across the small sanctuary. The ceremony itself passed in something of a blur for Ethan, his focus narrowed to Lillian's hands in his, the warmth of her smile, and the clear, unwavering "I do" she pronounced when the moment came. He was conscious of removing his gloves when it was time to place the ring on her finger, a simple gold band that had been his mother's, and of the softness of her skin against his scarred hands. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister declared, and the church erupted in applause as Ethan leaned forward to kiss his bride, still marveling that this extraordinary woman had chosen him, scars and all, to share her life with. The celebration that followed at Carson's house was joyous and extended well into the evening. The Archers, initially concerned about the propriety of a frontier wedding, found themselves genuinely enjoying the warmth and community spirit of the gathering. Mrs. Archer was particularly taken with Billy, who attached himself to her side for much of the evening, peppering her with questions about Boston and the ocean Ethan had mentioned wanting to see. As the night progressed and guests began to depart, Lillian and Ethan slipped away to the wagon that would take them to their newly expanded cabin. The moonlight illuminated the path as they drove in comfortable silence, both processing the magnitude of the day and the commitment they had made. At the cabin, Ethan insisted on carrying Lillian across the threshold, despite her laughing protests that it was unnecessary. Inside, the space had been transformed not just by the structural additions, but by the feminine touches. Lillian had added curtains at the windows, a colorful quilt on the new larger bed, her books arranged on shelves Ethan had crafted specifically to hold them. "Welcome home, Mrs. Wilcox," he said softly, setting her down gently in the center of the main room. "I like the sound of that," she replied, reaching up to touch his face with a tenderness that still sometimes caught him off guard. "And I like coming home to you." In the warm light of the oil lamps, with the soft crackling of the fire providing a gentle backdrop, Ethan finally allowed himself to fully believe in the reality of their union, not as a dream that might vanish with the morning light, but as the solid foundation of the life they would build together. "I love you," he said, the words that had once seemed impossible to utter now flowing naturally from his heart. "More than I can ever express." "Then show me," Lillian whispered, her eyes reflecting both innocence and determination as she took his hand and led him toward their bedroom. That night, as they discovered each other with tenderness and growing passion, Ethan finally shed the last vestiges of shame about his scars. In Lillian's loving gaze and gentle touch, he found not just acceptance but celebration of all that he was, the wounded and the healed parts alike, inseparable and equally worthy of love. Spring came early to New Mexico territory in 1881, bringing with it an abundance of wildflowers that transformed the usually austere landscape into a riot of color. The Wilcox homestead, as it had come to be known in Glenrio, had undergone its own transformation over the winter months, with a new barn under construction, and a garden plot carefully prepared for Lillian's first attempt at cultivating both flowers and vegetables in the challenging climate. Ethan's furniture-making business had flourished beyond his expectations, with orders now coming from as far away as Santa Fe and even Denver. What had begun as a means of supporting himself during his self-imposed isolation had developed into a respected enterprise, with Carson acting as his agent for the larger commissions that required shipping to distant locations. Lillian had continued to help at Carson's store several days a week, but had also begun teaching reading and writing to the younger children of Glenrio 2 afternoons a week, filling a need until the town could afford a proper school. Her botanical sketches, which she had initially pursued purely for pleasure, had attracted attention from a naturalist passing through on his way to catalog the flora of the Southwest, and she was now corresponding with a scientific society in Chicago about possibly publishing her drawings. Their marriage had settled into a rhythm of shared work and companionship that deepened with each passing day. The initial passion of their wedding night had matured into a physical relationship that was both tender and exciting, a mutual exploration that continued to reveal new facets of their connection. One evening in late April, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of orange and purple, Lillian took Ethan's hand and placed it gently on her stomach. "I've suspected for a few weeks," she said softly, "but Doc Miller confirmed it yesterday. We're going to have a baby, Ethan, sometime in November, he thinks." Ethan stared at her in wonder, his hand spreading protectively over the place where their child was growing. "A baby," he repeated, the simple word containing multitudes of emotion. How do you feel?" "Happy," she replied without hesitation. "A little nervous, of course it's only natural, but mostly just complete somehow, as if this was always meant to be part of our story." The mention of their story brought a smile to Ethan's face as he remembered the night of the storm, when Lillian had first touched his scars without hesitation and declared him beautiful to her. How far they had come since then, from 2 solitary souls to a family in the making. "I love you," he said, drawing her close to his side. "Both of you." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Ethan reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment of perfect contentment. The fire that had once seemed to define the boundaries of his existence before and after, whole and broken, had instead become merely one chapter in a continuing narrative, significant but no longer all-encompassing. Lillian's head rested against his shoulder, her breathing soft, and even as she too contemplated the future they were building together. In the distance, a coyote called to its mate, the sound echoing across the valley that had become their home. "What shall we name the baby?" Lillian asked after a while, her voice dreamy with possibilities. "Sarah if it's a girl," Ethan suggested immediately. For Carson's wife, she'd have loved knowing her cousin found happiness here. Lillian nodded against his shoulder. "And if it's a boy," Ethan considered for a moment. "James," he said finally. "For your cousin who brought you here, and for my father who taught me everything I know about working with my hands." "Sarah or James Wilcox," Lillian murmured, testing the names. "They sound right, don't they? Like they're already waiting to join us." As the night deepened around them, bringing with it the familiar chorus of desert creatures and the gentle rustle of wind through the cottonwoods, Ethan felt a profound sense of gratitude for the unexpected turns his life had taken. The scars that had once seemed to define him had led directly to this moment, this woman, this future unfolding before them like the vast New Mexico sky, limitless and full of promise. The baby, a healthy boy they named James Ethan Wilcox, arrived on a crisp November morning just as the first light of dawn was breaking over the eastern horizon. After a long but uncomplicated labor attended by Doc Miller and Mrs. Flores, Lillian held their son in her arms while Ethan looked on in awe, scarcely able to believe that something so perfect could have come from him. "He has your eyes," Lillian said softly, tracing a gentle finger along the baby's smooth cheek. "And I think perhaps your chin as well." "Let's hope he has your intelligence and patience," Ethan replied, carefully sitting on the edge of the bed to get a closer look at his son. "And your courage." Lillian smiled up at him, tired but radiant. "Our courage," she corrected gently. "It's always been a shared quality between us, I think." As winter settled over Glenrio, the Wilcox family established new routines centered around young James's needs and the rhythms of frontier life. The cabin, now expanded again to include a nursery, was a warm haven against the occasional snow and frequent cold winds that swept across the territory. Ethan had completed the construction of his workshop adjacent to the house, allowing him to continue his furniture-making business while remaining close enough to assist with the baby when needed. Lillian, after a brief period of recovery, had resumed her botanical sketching, often with James sleeping peacefully in a cradle Ethan had crafted specially for him, its curved rockers designed to mimic the gentle motion of being held. Carson and Billy were frequent visitors, with Billy taking his role as honorary uncle very seriously, bringing small carved toys for the baby and regaling Ethan with tales of his progress in tracking and identifying local wildlife. The Archers had traveled from Boston again for the birth of their first grandchild, staying through Christmas before reluctantly returning east with promises to visit again in the spring. The broader community of Glenrio had also embraced the arrival of the newest Wilcox, with gifts and well wishes arriving regularly from townsfolk who had once regarded Ethan with fear or pity, but now counted him among their own. Even Mabel Turner had brought a meticulously stitched quilt for the baby, a gesture of reconciliation that Lillian had graciously accepted. As James grew from newborn to infant to toddler, the scars that had once defined Ethan's existence became increasingly incidental to his daily life. There were still occasional moments of self-consciousness when meeting strangers or catching an unexpected glimpse of his reflection, but they were brief and diminishing in frequency. More often, he found himself simply living without constant awareness of his disfigurement, laughing with his son, working alongside Carson, making love with Lillian in the quiet darkness of their bedroom. By the time James was 3, the family had expanded again with the birth of twin daughters, Eleanor and Sarah, whose arrival in the summer of 1884 transformed the Wilcox household into a bustling center of activity. Ethan's business had grown to the point where he occasionally employed an assistant, a young man from town with a natural aptitude for woodworking, whom Ethan was gradually training in the finer aspects of the craft. Lillian's botanical illustrations had been published as part of a scientific survey of the region, earning her not only recognition, but also commissions for similar work from other researchers. She had balanced these professional accomplishments with her roles as mother, wife, and continuing helper at Carson's store, which had expanded to include a modest lending library at her suggestion. On the 5th anniversary of their wedding, Ethan surprised Lillian with a journey not just to Santa Fe or even Denver, but all the way to San Francisco, where they stood together on the beach and watched the Pacific Ocean stretch endlessly toward the horizon. "It's everything you said the Atlantic was," Ethan murmured, his arm around her waist as they stood with the wind in their hair and the taste of salt on their lips. "Terrifying and beautiful all at once." "Worth waiting for," Lillian agreed, leaning into his embrace. Like so many of the best things in life, as they watched the sun sink toward the water in a blaze of color that rivaled even the most spectacular New Mexico sunset, Ethan reflected on the long journey that had brought him from the burning Carson homestead to this peaceful moment beside the sea. The fire that had scarred him had also, in its way, forged him, testing and tempering his spirit as surely as the flames had altered his flesh. And from those ashes had risen not just survival, but a life of unexpected richness. A wife who saw beauty where others saw only damage, children who knew him simply as their father with no awareness that the world might see him differently, a community that had learned to look beyond appearances to the man beneath. "What are you thinking?" Lillian asked, looking up at him with the same direct gaze that had first captured his attention in Hartman's general store all those years ago. "That I'm the luckiest man alive," he replied honestly, drawing her closer against the evening chill. "And that I wouldn't change a single moment that let us hear not even the fire." Lillian reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the familiar landscape of his scars with the tenderness that had never diminished over the years. "Nor would I," she said softly. "For they brought me to you, and you've made my life more beautiful than I ever dreamed possible." As the last rays of sunlight disappeared below the horizon, and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Ethan kissed his wife with all the love and gratitude that had grown between them, a love that had begun with a touch and a whispered affirmation in the aftermath of tragedy, and had blossomed into a life neither of them could have imagined on their own. The ocean stretched before them, vast and mysterious, much like the future that still awaited them. But whatever challenges and joys that future might hold, they would face them as they had faced all others together, with courage and faith in each other's strength. Their scars and triumphs equally part of the beautiful tapestry they continued to weave with each passing day.